Once at the end of the war, I attended a reception in The Hague on the occasion of the liberation of the city from German occupation. Among the guests were representatives of the Allied command and diplomats. I did not really want to go to this reception, but it was impossible to refuse. At the reception, everything was as you have seen many times in pre-war Hollywood movies. Servants in smart livery carried glasses of champagne on trays. The women were in evening gowns and the men in tuxedos. I tried to keep out of the way. Suddenly someone clapped me on the shoulder. I turned around and saw the smiling face of a man I didn't know, but he called me by my last name and introduced himself as Colonel Van Easton. We chatted about little things, and then the colonel drew my attention to a huge painting hanging across the room from us. Painting, especially the works of Dutch artists of the 16th and 17th centuries, was a passion of mine, so I was glad when my companion brought it up. It turned out that he also knows painting quite well, loves fine art, and is a fine connoisseur of it. In the course of the conversation, Easton invited me to visit his home and promised to introduce me to his collection of paintings. The colonel lived not far from the place where the reception was held, and I gladly agreed to go to him without waiting for the end of the reception. Easton's apartment was furnished with great taste. On the walls of the drawing room hung paintings by Rembrandt's pupils. One of the paintings caught my eye. It hung separately in a small alcove. It showed a smiling young man in 17th century clothes. I had seen it once before, but I couldn't remember where. "You're a real connoisseur," Easton said, noticing my interest in the painting. "It's the best of my paintings, isn't it? Do you know who painted it?" "I think it was Ferdinand Payne," I answered. "That's right. It's a Beaulieu painting. By the way, very few people know the author of the painting, although everyone likes it," Easton said. "I thank you for the compliment, but I have one advantage over your other guests. It's not the first time I've seen the painting. I saw it about 15 years ago, I think, in Leander's collection." "That's right. That painting still belongs to poor Leander. I just rented it." "Why is Leander a poor man?" I asked. "What happened to him?" "Don't you know?" Easton wondered. "I thought it had been known for a long time." "Not to me. The last time I heard of Leander was just before the war started. He was rich and prosperous then." "Oh, a lot has changed for Leander since then. If you want me to tell you about him," Easton offered, and I readily agreed. Easton told me that before the war Leander had been one of the leading collectors of paintings in Holland. He had made a huge fortune by skillfully dealing in paintings. But in his personal life, Leander was not so fortunate. He bought a palace for a lot of money, and almost every day to organize a drinking party, with constantly surrounded by his ladies of half-secret and all sorts of henchmen. Gradually, Leander's wealth began to melt away. He needed to take some drastic measures to improve his financial affairs. One day, about a year before the outbreak of war, there was a fire in Leander's palace, where he kept his collection. The collection was insured, and the insurance company, of course, thoroughly investigated the cause of the fire. The investigation revealed that Leander had set the fire deliberately in order to collect the insurance money. Leander was convicted and imprisoned almost until the occupation of Holland by the Germans.
Realizing that he could not regain prestige in Holland, Leander moved to Hamburg, where he lived throughout the war.
When the Allies occupied Hamburg, their counterintelligence suspected Leander of collaborating with the Germans. Leander was arrested. He is now in prison awaiting the conclusion of the investigation into his case. "That's why I called him a poor man," Easton finished his story. "He had committed a crime before the war and was punished. But can you blame Leander for his decision to go to Germany? It was fate that he ended up in a country that had become our enemy." "It's a sad story," I said. "I didn't know Leander very well, and it was a long time ago. I never heard that he was convicted. But why did you tell me all this?" "Because you were interested in the painting that belonged to Leander. And besides, I thought his story would be of interest to you as a counterintelligence agent. I want to help Leander, and maybe you can help me in return." I remained silent, and Easton, seeing my embarrassment, continued. I've been to see Leander in prison. He's not feeling well, and he'll thank anyone who helps him. You mean the painting? It took my breath away. It all started with a conversation between two cultured people about painting, and now suddenly it was a deal, a direct bribe. If I understand you correctly, you think I'm capable of committing an official crime. You think I can be bought. No way. We are not talking about bribery, but only about a small gift for a favour, said Aston, smiling. But this small gift is worth about 250,000 guilders, isn't it? Yes, that's the market price. I am not at liberty to inquire into your financial affairs, but it seems to me that you are not rich, are you? But let's leave that question and look at things soberly. First of all, I didn't ask you to commit a crime or to seek the illegal release of a criminal. I'm only asking you to look into Leander's case and expedite his release if his innocence is established. If that is all you ask, I remarked, why offer me a bribe? You could have simply asked me to take up your friend's case personally, and quickly. Now you've put me in a difficult position. It was Leander's idea, said Aston embarrassedly. When I was in his prison, he told me that he knew you. He's a businessman, and he's used to making deals. That's the kind of man he is. Help him, and he won't be in debt. He's still very rich. For you or me, a gift like that would be a fortune, but for him it's nothing. Listen, Aston, I interrupted the colonel. We've gone too far. I appreciate your skill as an orator, but a bribe is out of the question. Leander will have to wait. There's nothing I can do to help him now. A few days after this conversation, I was reminded more than once of my excessive pride. Out of curiosity, I inquired about the Leander case, and it turned out that the investigation had been going on for a long time, and the case was nearing its end. The investigator in charge of Leander's case was an old acquaintance of mine. He immediately told me that Leander would probably be fully rehabilitated. According to the investigation materials, Leander lived in Hamburg throughout the war and did not cooperate with the Germans, although he did not give up his commercial operations. My acquaintance expressed confidence that Leander would be released as soon as possible. Thus, if I agreed to accept Aston's offer, I would be the owner of a marvellous painting worth 25,000 guilders, without deviating one iota from the letter of the law. Of course, my personal intervention would not have affected the outcome of the case, but neither Leander nor Aston would have thought of it. In any case, my conscience would have been clear, and besides, there is no law against an officer accepting gifts from his friends. And yet there was one doubtful point in the Leander case. It took me a long time to realize the nature of these doubts, but some instinct seemed to guard me against accepting Aston's offer. The answer to my doubts was finally found in the papers of Leander's pre-war case in connection with the charge of seeking to obtain an insurance sum illegally. Among my acquaintances was the publisher of a Dutch newspaper, and he readily provided me with a set of clippings on the Leander case. I spent a whole day studying these materials and became acquainted with the Leander case in every detail. Persistence and perseverance paid off. A week later, I had the opportunity to meet Aston again at one of the staff meetings. So, how are things in the art world? I greeted Aston. What paintings are you interested in now? I am very much obliged to you, Aston replied, smiling. I am very sorry that I did not have the opportunity to thank you earlier. For what? You remember, of course, that marvellous painting by Bowl, which you refused to accept as a gift. Well, after I was released, Leander gave it to me, and he was so insistent on accepting it that I could not refuse him. I'm glad you got it, I said with a chuckle. What's the matter? Why are you grinning? Aston asked nervously. The fact is, dear Aston, that you have been deceived. The painting given to you is not the original. It can't be. How do you know that? You must be saying it out of jealousy, Aston said excitedly. A man who sets a fire to get insurance money is not a simpleton. He's always driven by cold calculation. He is capable of deception, even when giving a gift to a friend. Empty words, shouted Aston. All right, I replied. You may not believe me, but go to the documents and read the testimony of the insurance company's expert witness at the trial. You'll find out that Leander then demanded payment of the insurance sums for the paintings which were supposedly burned. but were in fact stored in a safe place. But to achieve his goal, Leander had to destroy several valuable paintings. Among them was a painting by Bowl. You now have a copy of this painting, a fine copy, but still a copy. It's worth about 1,000 guilders, not 250,000. So it's a forgery again, and only a forgery. I first heard about Johnny a week or two after the end of the war in Europe. At the end of May 1945, a meeting of former leaders of the resistance movement was held in Eindhoven, to which I was invited. One day, during a break in the meeting, I was sitting in a cafe talking to two members of the resistance movement. One of my interlocutors was a man named Bluth, the other was called Ritten. It had become customary that every time we met, battle buddies would reminisce about the dead. I don't remember who, but I think Ritten suddenly said, "We have to make sure Johnny gets a posthumous award." "Why posthumously?" Bluth interrupted him. "Because he's alive." "No, I know for a fact he's dead." "That can't be, unless something has happened to him in the last few weeks." "My friend saw Johnny 2 months ago," insisted Bluth. "And yet I can't believe it." "I saw his grave with my own eyes near Zutphen," said Ritten. "A grave is not proof," said Bluth. "You can dig a hole and write any name you want on a tombstone. I won't believe Johnny's dead until I see his corpse myself. It's probably just another one of his pranks. I'm sure of it." "But how will you be able to identify his corpse if you find it?" Ritten asked. "Didn't you know Johnny personally?" "No, but I still can't believe he's dead. At least not until I have hard evidence." My interlocutors were beginning to repeat themselves in their arguments, and I was overcome by a strong curiosity and desire to know who Johnny was. To end the argument, I asked, "Which Johnny are you talking about? I have never heard of him, although I know many of the leaders and active participants in the resistance movement." "You've never heard of Johnny?" Ritten asked with surprise. "No." "Colonel," said Ritten firmly, "we all did something for our country, but none of us can compare to Johnny. I am surprised that he is not known in England. After all, he was an Englishman." "He is still an Englishman," Bluth corrected Ritten.
Whether he lives or dies, Johnny will always be a great man.
"But who is he?" I insisted. "Where did he get that name?" "He was a pilot," Bluth replied. "His plane was shot down over Hilversum early last year. Johnny was wounded, but he managed to take refuge on some farm near Zutphen. After recovering, he decided to stay in Holland and here to continue fighting the enemy." The resistance movement in northeast Holland was never very active. There were a lot of German troops in these areas, and due to the proximity of the border, the situation remained tense at all times. But it was to be seen how things changed with Johnny's appearance. He let the German echelons under the skeleton, set up ambushes on the roads, organised attacks on German headquarters. During the landing of British paratroopers in Arnhem, Johnny deployed active operations behind German lines. If there had been more men like him, the British might have held Arnhem. "What was his real name?" I asked. "What did he look like?" "We just called him Johnny." It never occurred to anyone to ask what his real name was or what his surname was. "But could you describe him?" "I've never seen him," Ritten answered. "Neither have I," Bluth joined him. "You see, a month ago there was practically no communication between the southwest and northeast parts of the country." "But there must be someone who knew Johnny personally," I insisted. "He couldn't have fought alone. Where did he get his weapons? Where did he live? Someone must have helped him. Who were these men?" "Colonel," said Bluth, smiling, "you know how to ask questions, but unfortunately we can't answer them. Why don't you go to Zutphen? There will surely be people there who can tell you more than we can." "They say that Johnny's closest assistant was a beautiful girl," Ritten added. "Why don't you go and see her, Colonel?" "I shall certainly do so. My professional ego would not allow me to do otherwise." The conversation turned to another subject, and after an hour we parted. The meeting had finished its work, and I had to return to my direct duties as an investigator of those suspected of collaborating with the Germans during the war. I simply did not have time to deal with Johnny's mystery. Apparently much of what Written and Bluth had said was true, but more details were needed to solve the mystery. Most British pilots, once in German-occupied territory and not captured, made contact with the local resistance movement and were helped to return home. As far as I was aware, some pilots had to go into hiding for months, or even years on some remote farm, waiting for the country to be liberated from the occupiers. It is quite possible that Johnny stayed in the area where his plane was shot down and joined the local organization of the resistance movement. Rumors spread quickly during the war, and if Johnny really acted heroically, the word of mouth could easily turn him into a new Robin Hood. If this was the case, then after the liberation of the northeastern parts of the country, it seems likely that Johnny would have hurried back home to his unit. There may even be a pilot's personnel file in the Air Ministry archives in London, containing a record of how Johnny returned to his unit and what he did during the time he was in Holland. Just at this time I happened to meet an officer I knew from British Air Force intelligence, and he agreed to help me. First of all, it was decided to establish whether the case of loss of an airplane during the British air raid on the Hilversum area in 1944, and whether the pilot, who was missing at that time, had not returned home. A week later a reply came from London stating the following. John Bruce went missing in action during a sortie in the Basim-Hilversum area on January 22, 1944. Considered captured or killed. Not found among officers released from German POW camps. That was the end of the first phase of my search for Johnny. I now knew his real first and last name. I was able to continue my search only a month later. I was in the neighbourhood of Zutphen on duty and decided to visit the town. I was introduced to a leader of a resistance group named Harling. He lived on a small farm on the outskirts of Zutphen. Harling greeted me very warmly and began to tell me with great enthusiasm about Johnny's heroic deeds, raids on German wagons, sabotage on the railroads, and the seizure of arms depots. Where is Johnny now? I asked when Harling had finished his story. Don't you know? The poor guy's dead. He's buried not far from here. How did he die? It was an accident, an irony. How did it happen? When the Germans were driven out of our area, the authorities ordered all resistance organizations to surrender their arms and ammunition. On the farm where Johnny lived, there was a stockpile of dynamite. Johnny decided to check the stockpile and there was an explosion. No one knows how it happened, but Johnny was killed. His remains were buried there on the farm. It's a shame about that man, but war is war. Where were you at the time? I wasn't in town at the time. I found out all this later from Annie Dykers. Who is this woman? You haven't met Annie yet? Well, of course you just got here. You must see Annie Dykers. She knew Johnny better than anyone. She was the one who brought Johnny to the farm after his plane was shot down. Annie walked the wounded pilot out and then became his closest assistant. Annie and her younger brother Jan had long wanted to join the organization of the resistance movement, but no one would accept them. But then Johnny came along, and suddenly Annie began to give us one order after another. She had fought the Germans more successfully than many of us. We all thought that Annie was in love with Johnny, and that after the war they would get married. What did Johnny look like? I asked. Harling hesitated and scratched the back of his head. I can't tell you that. I never had to see him up close. I only saw him once at night. But one of your comrades must have seen him and told me what he looked like. It couldn't be that a man lived in the city for a year and no one saw him, could it? Annie and her brother could certainly describe Johnny's appearance. During the war, people were used to being cautious even when talking to close friends. Johnny was very cautious and rarely appeared in town during the day. He didn't want the Gestapo to track him down. In addition, I know from Annie's story that Johnny had badly hurt his face on landing when his plane was shot down. That's probably why Johnny was uncomfortable being out in public. You said you met Johnny at night. Can't you at least describe him in general terms? All I can say is that he's a man of below average height, thin, about the same height as Annie's brother, only a little broader in the shoulders. Of course, such a description of a man's appearance would not satisfy many people. However good a leader of the resistance movement Harling was, his powers of observation were clearly not up to par. Yet I could not complain about fate. I had new data and opportunities for further searches. Harling explained to me how to find the Dykers' farm, and the next morning I was on my way. I wanted my arrival to be unexpected, and so I did not give the Dykers any warning of my arrival. I found the Dykerses at work on the farm. The woman, seeing me, came to the hedge. She wiped her hands on her apron and said hello. She looked 22 to 23 years old. Even in her simple peasant clothes, she was surprisingly beautiful. I introduced myself and explained that the authorities had assigned me to investigate the circumstances of Johnny's death. Annie took the cigarette I offered her in a manly manner and lit it. In all her movements it was clear that she was the mistress of the farm. When she called out to her brother, he immediately dropped his work and ran up to her. Jan Dykers was about 16 to 17 years old. This skinny little fellow answered exactly the description Johnny Harling had given of him. He looked a lot like his sister, but for some reason he was more wary than Annie. I apologized for disturbing their work, but Annie immediately brushed my apology aside and offered to go inside. We settled at the table in the kitchen. Annie told me in detail how they had first met Johnny, how they had then fought the occupiers together. Her story was nothing new to me, but Annie suggested that we go to the ruins of the barn where Johnny had died in the explosion, and then to his grave in a field not far from the house. On the grave I saw a small wooden cross with the inscription, Pilot John Bruce. When we returned to the house, Annie showed me the pilot's wallet and his scarf, the same one he had been wearing the day his plane was lost near Hilversum. I thanked Annie for her help and said in passing, the war was over and Johnny's parents might wish to take his ashes for burial in England. Jan, who had hitherto remained silent, exclaimed, "No, you can't do that." Annie quickly came to her brother's aid and said calmly, "I think Ian means that Johnny would prefer to be buried where he fought so brilliantly. Then, of course, he should have been buried at the site of the plane crash. After all, that's where Johnny ended up as a fighter," I remarked. "What are you saying?" Annie said, after a moment's silence. "Just guessing," I replied. In front of me are two young Dutchmen, a brother and a sister. They had long sought to become members of the resistance movement, but no one wanted to accept them. Suddenly, one night, a badly wounded English pilot shows up at their house. The brother and sister do everything possible to save his life, but the pilot dies. The young people bury the pilot and keep the things that belong to him, a purse and a scarf. After the death of the pilot, the legend of Johnny is born. This idea may have occurred to the sister after all. She is much more energetic than her brother. No one knows about the pilot's death, and if they organize a resistance group, which he supposedly leads, such a group will enjoy great support from the population. During the day, the pilot hides. He supposedly does not want people to see his disfigured face. He meets with members of the resistance movement only at night, and everyone finds in him a resemblance to Jan Dykers. And how could they not? Ian Dykers is Johnny. Johnny's group wins one success after another, inspiring other resistance organizations to fight. But now the war is over and the question arises what to do with Johnny. The brother and sister are well aware that soon this legendary hero will be of interest. The ghost must disappear once and for all. An explosion is set off in the barn and Johnny disappears. A new cross appears on his grave. That's how I see the whole story. Maybe I'm wrong. An intelligent person can draw many different conclusions from the facts, Annie replied. But what proof do you have? The proof is in the grave under the white cross. If I am right, the body of a man who died a year and a half ago is buried there. If you're right, we'll only find the remains of a man who died in an explosion 2 or 3 months ago. Are we going to open the grave? There's no need for that, Annie said quietly. You're right, of course. What do you intend to do now?
Nothing. I just want to shake hands with 2 young patriots who did their best for their country. What are we going to do with the dead pilot's body? Annie asked me when I was about to leave.
Leave his ashes alone. It is not often that young pilots have to continue the fight after death. A few minutes later I got in the car and drove to Zutphen.
In the first months of 1942 I felt very tired. The war had already been going on for 2.5 years. During this time I was involved in the screening of many thousands of refugees who had taken refuge in England to escape the Nazis. At first, I and my colleagues, who were also involved in the screening, worked in the most primitive conditions in one of 5 reception centres organised by the London County Council. These 5 centres were located in the boroughs of Fulham Road, Balham Bushy Park, Crystal Palace and Norwood. The last one I had to become more familiar with than the others. It had once been a hospital. A barbed wire fence had been hastily erected around the carefully guarded grounds.
When a new batch of refugees arrived at the centre, something unimaginable happened there. Speaking in different languages, children screaming, women crying, old people in a state of total confusion. People who had been hiding from pursuit for days and even weeks could not afford to be fastidious. And yet it was necessary to give them shelter, provide them with hot meals, and finally begin the most important task of screening the refugees for safety. Often, especially in the winter of 1940 and the spring of 1941, the arrival of new shipments of refugees was accompanied by the rumble of air raids, and then the usual confusion became a living hell. German aviation, trying to destroy London, used the tactic of striking the area, and the objects of bombing were the areas of Crystal Palace and Norwood. Thus, the refugee reception centres received a solid dose of air raids and bombing.
So, in the spring of 1942, I felt war fatigue. Practically, I had not had a vacation since September 1939 and now increasingly dreamed of leaving London and spending a day away from the city, leaving the bombing and security problems behind, relaxing my muscles and enjoying the birdsong. So when the opportunity suddenly presented itself, I grabbed it with both hands.
One morning we received word of the arrival in Lisbon of a well-known leader of the Dutch resistance movement, who went by the alias Albert. Albert had been secretly smuggled out of Holland by one of the routes prepared by members of the resistance movement. Albert's arrival at one of the airfields in southern England was expected in the afternoon on the day the message was received. As Albert had left Holland recently, his information about the situation in the country was of considerable interest. In order to get all the information he could from Albert as quickly as possible, he was to be met by a member of our staff who spoke fluent Dutch. So I decided to do it myself. It was a warm, sunny spring day, and I was glad to think of a trip through the English countryside as a distraction from my daily cares. After breakfast I left for the airfield in a staff car with a soldier driver. And now, after many months of desk work in London, I was rushing in the car, leaning back in the seat and half closing my eyes, and felt with pleasure the gusts of fresh wind from the open window of the car on my face. I could not have imagined a greater pleasure. As I listened absent-mindedly to my companions ranting in the purest Cockney, I thought about why all army drivers are such big talkers, and occasionally mumbled something under my breath to show that I was listening to him. We arrived at the airport well ahead of schedule. There was a sentry at the barrier. The corporal on duty fascinated me with his diligence and thoroughness in checking our passes. Finally, he opened the barrier and saluted us goodbye. At that time, it sometimes happened that unauthorized persons entered camps and military facilities by showing a pass signed Adolf Hitler. The editorial staff of one newspaper, carried away with the gimmick, dressed its employee in full stormtrooper uniform and sent him to Whitehall. No one took any notice of him, except a few dutiful soldiers who saluted the newly minted stormtrooper, mistaking him for an officer of the Free French Army. Vigilance had never been the hallmark of the British. The car pulled up to the front of a handsome, typically English country mansion, situated on the edge of the airfield on a site enclosed by a barbed wire fence. I later learned that at the outbreak of war the airfield's runways had been enlarged and the mansion and its surrounding land had to be confiscated. The chief of the airbase occupied the house as his headquarters and apartment, leaving only a couple of rooms for an officers' meeting, attended mostly by senior officers. Younger pilots had thoughtfully located their club room away from the headquarters and the ears of their superiors. Just in case, I arrived at the airfield a good half hour before the arrival of the plane from Lisbon. Entering the house, I asked the messenger to escort me to the chief of the airbase. The latter was already waiting and greeted me with a friendly hello. Barely having time to seat me, he ordered tea over the telephone, the universal English remedy for all ailments. I suspected that the tea party was a distraction from his usual duties. He was hosting a member of the cloak and dagger profession, as intelligence and counterintelligence are often called, and he knew, moreover, that an important refugee would soon arrive at the airfield. All this, taken together, was far beyond the usual monotonous activities of an air-base chief. In our work, one gets used to almost unconsciously analysing strangers and evaluating their personal qualities. I did not talk to the chief of the airbase in 5 minutes, as I felt that I already know the most pronounced features of his character. He was a man in his 40s, with thinning hair and deep wrinkles around his mouth and eyes, which gave away his restless character. He wore a pilot's patch over his left breast pocket of his uniform, but had no bar of orders or medals. It seemed unlikely that in the 3rd year of the war an officer pilot in the active army would become a lieutenant colonel without being awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. I therefore decided that the owner of the house was a career RAF officer who had, by the outbreak of war, crossed the prescribed age limit for flying and so had become a staff officer.
It was the practice of the British Air Force to keep a permanent staff at each airbase, whose duties included guarding the area, maintaining aircraft, organising meals and administrative services for the flying units stationed at the base. There was often friction between the crews of airplanes arriving at the base and the permanent personnel of the airbase. The chief of the airbase was responsible for maintaining discipline of all personnel, and it was not an easy task. The chief of the airbase often had to deal with hot guys, among whom there were equal to him, and sometimes even older than him in rank. Many probably looked at him as an old penguin, a bird with wings but unable to fly.
It seemed to me that working at the airbase depressed LT. Cole. Gawkins. He was friendly, but he was extremely nervous and suddenly went into a long discourse about the unworthy behaviour of some young pilots, mentioned their wild entertainment in the evenings at the officers' club. According to Gawkins, young pilots in his day did not dare to say a word in an officers' meeting unless one of their senior officers spoke to them. And now, before a guy is a pilot, he's already sporting his captain's stripes. In the old days it took years to get another rank. I tactfully tried to point out that the rapidity of promotion was due to a high casualty rate, and that no one would envy a young man's fleeting exhilaration and rank when there was little chance of enjoying either for a long time. Gawkins politely, but with nervous determination, rejected my theory. During our conversation he jumped up now and then, went to the window which overlooked one of the main landing strips, and looked out, evidently in case the plane from Lisbon appeared unexpectedly. Gawkins was highly agitated. He glanced incessantly at his watch and called twice to the control tower to see if there was any news of the plane. It was excruciatingly painful to watch him, and I was very glad when at last the telephone rang and the control tower duty officer reported that the plane was over the airfield and would be landing in about 3 minutes.
The incoming planes were stopping at the far end of the airfield. Gawkins told me that a squad car was standing there to take my guest and the other passengers to the officers' room.
Gawkins and I stood on the porch of the house and looked out into the bright spring sunshine, waiting for the car to approach. Finally it stopped a few feet away from us and 4 men got out. The first was, I assumed, a representative of the diplomatic department. This was evident from the black bowler of the type commonly called Anthony Eden, which may be said to be the distinguishing mark of senior officials of the Foreign Office. As if to emphasize his position, this man carried a solid black briefcase. He was followed out of the car by a pretty girl with long blonde hair, a little over 20 years of age, and an elderly, respectable-looking man, who straightened up somewhat primly and took the girl under his arm with a patronizing look. Last was a confused middle-aged man with a brown paper roll in his hand. This was Albert, no doubt. As I descended the stairs towards him, I could not refrain from looking at the strange couple, a young attractive girl and an old man. The nature of my work develops a visual memory for faces. At some point I suddenly thought that somewhere I had already seen the face of this old man. I could see him both in public places and in a newspaper photograph. The old man must have been an important person, and the imperious way in which he held himself and snapped his fingers to attract Gawkins's attention, made it clear that he was not without pride. At that very moment, memory came to the rescue. Yes, of course. In the happy days of peace, I had seen in the newspapers a picture of this old man standing in the royal box at Ascot Racecourse and attending the ceremonies of the court. He held the title of peer and was famous for his great wealth and ancient lineage. For the sake of preserving the honour of this family, we shall hereafter refer to him as the Duke of Monmouth. Walking towards Albert, I involuntarily asked myself, why would an elderly aristocrat and a young girl travel together, and moreover from Lisbon to London? Could she be his niece? During the war years, prominent members of society, especially aristocrats, while performing some official assignments, hired their own relatives as junior members of their own staff and took them with them on various trips. However, seeing the intimate gesture with which the old man took the girl under his arm, I realized that their relationship was not based on blood kinship, but on a different basis. I remembered the stories I had heard in the clubs of Piccadilly about the exploits of the Duke, who did not miss an opportunity to come. In his youth he was involved in at least 2 major scandals, and the reputation of the ladies' man was retained for him in his mature years. That aspect of his life, however, did not interest me. I was concerned about security in general and Albert in particular. The diplomat left in a black government car, standing next to my protective coloured staff car. Gawkins went to introduce himself to the Duke and his companion, while I shook hands with an embarrassed Albert. We left the others at the door of the officers' meeting and headed for the small reception area that the airbase commander had placed at my disposal. Following established practice, I checked the papers of the man known to me as Albert, including a letter from our embassy in Lisbon. With a few careful questions, I ascertained the veracity of Albert's words about himself. He quickly proved that he was exactly who we thought he was, and we moved on to talk about the situation in Holland, the situation and morale of the various groups in the resistance movement, and the numbering and location of German military units. Albert did have quite interesting information, but the first superficial questioning did not reveal anything that required an urgent solution. Albert, of course, had the opportunity to clarify the data we had and to help us test various hypotheses. That was all. There was a knock on the door, and Gawkins' messenger entered. He apologized for the intrusion and said that the chief of the airbase wanted to talk to me urgently and invited me to his office. I was annoyed that we had been interrupted, apologized to Albert, and went to get the messenger. When I crossed the threshold of Gawkins's study, I realized at once that I was in the middle of an argument. The red-faced Duke stood beside the desk, towering over the unhappy Gawkins, who had all but retreated into his chair to dodge the verbal attack. A pretty blonde stood at the window and watched the scene. Seeing that the number of listeners increased, the Duke again went on the offensive. "This is a scandal," he shouted, slamming his fist on the table. "Do you doubt the truth of my words, sir? Miss Dykstra is an old friend of mine. I vouch for her good name. Do you hear me, sir? By God, if you don't let us go on our way at once, you'll hear from me again." "What is the matter?" I asked. Gawkins apologized to the foaming nobleman, grabbed my arm, and dragged me out of the room and into the hallway. As the door slammed shut, he leaned against the wall and wiped his forehead with his handkerchief. "Oh my God," said Gawkins. "It's that Dutch doll he brought with him. He swears she's an old family friend, and I suppose he picked her up in Lisbon. God for him and his sexual problems. I'm not going to get into them. But you see, she has no ID or passport. She may well turn out to be a charming spy. By God, I don't know what to do. If I let them go and she turns out to be a suspicious person or even a spy, I'll be court-martialed. If I detain them and she turns out to be above suspicion, the old Duke will have my head cooked instead of steak for dinner."
"Have you at least questioned her?" I asked.
"Of course. But she only speaks Dutch, and I don't know it. This is the sort of thing that is not covered in flight manuals." I felt truly sorry for the airbase commander, who was in a bind. He was really in a very unusual position for him. Since the interview with Albert was almost over, I decided to come to Gawkins' aid. "You don't mind my interference? I speak Dutch, and one of my functions is to interview incoming foreigners." Oh, I was so hoping you'd suggest that. Gawkins breathed a sigh of relief. I would be extremely grateful if you could help me find a way out. But in the name of all the saints, do it as soon as possible. The old man has already threatened to call his friend Winston and God knows who else. He'll burst with rage if we delay him much longer. We went back to the room. I introduced myself to the Duke, showing my identification and stating also that it was my duty to interview his companion. His lordship had found a new object for cursing. Breathing heavily, he turned toward me like an elephant preparing to attack. First of all, he wished to know who I thought I was, and said that I was nothing but a petty bureaucrat trying to show my power. The Duke added that he vouched for Miss Dykstra, and threatened to teach me a lesson for distrusting so important a person as he. I stood waiting for the outpouring of anger to subside. It wasn't the first time I'd been yelled at. After all, even the most eloquent and most angry person's supply of curses runs out.
After a while, the Duke calmed down a bit. When he was finally able to speak, I repeated that we were on military property and that I was an officer doing my duty. No one could leave the airfield until I had spoken to Miss Dykstra, and the longer his lordship delayed that conversation, the longer we would all have to wait. I also said that if he wished to make a formal complaint against me, I would gladly give him my name, rank, and registration number, but that I would not move until I had interviewed his companion.
The Duke's face turned purple. The veins in his forehead swelled. He launched into another tirade, this time going on about my, from his point of view, questionable past and even more questionable future. Finally, he ran out of steam. After he stopped shouting, Duke said he was only willing to wait 5 minutes while I spoke to Miss Dykstra, and that he expected to receive a written apology from me and the airbase commander when we were convinced of our mistake.
At my sign, Gawkins led the Duke away to the officer's room, where I hoped a good shot of brandy would help soothe his wounded pride. I returned to the reception room where Albert was sitting, quickly explained the situation to him, and asked him to wait a little longer. Then I wrote a short dispatch about Albert's arrival and rendezvous, informing him that there was nothing urgent. The telephonist at the airfield immediately began dictating this message over a telephone equipped with a cipher.
Having finished with all this, I wasted no time in returning to the office of the airbase chief, where Dykstra was under guard. I invited her to sit at the desk, and myself in the chair opposite. Dykstra was certainly beautiful. Blonde women of northern latitudes often have cold perfection in their facial features, but Dykstra's appearance, even in moments of calmness, could not conceal her inherent liveliness and warmth. The conversation began in Dutch, although I strongly suspected that she knew English much better than she had shown in her conversation with Gawkins. In the work of a counterintelligence officer, internal premonitions sometimes lead to serious mistakes, and therefore you cannot rely too much on the appearance of the interlocutor. I have met people with repulsive appearance, who, nevertheless, were honest and honourable. And at the same time, one of the most heartless killers I have known was a small woman with large blue eyes.
Something about Miss Dykstra's appearance alarmed me. She looked too pampered to be believed. It was too hard to imagine MS, Dykstra as a liaison to the resistance movement, who had just made the arduous journey on foot. After a few stenciled questions, I asked MS Dykstra to tell me about herself. She answered simply and seemed to be candid. MS. Dykstra worked in Amsterdam as secretary to the head of an export-import firm. The coming of the Germans in 1940 led to a reduction in business and the closing of the firm.
Its owner, partly out of patriotic motives, partly out of revenge against the Nazis who had ruined him, became active in the resistance movement. She was only 19 years old at the time. She admitted that she didn't dislike the Germans too much, but she liked her host, and there was something romantic about the activities of the resistance movement. As a result, she became a liaison between two independent resistance groups in Amsterdam, one of which was led by the former owner of the firm. Everything going on around her strongly resembled the stories about spies she had been forced to read. The Germans had closed most of the entertainment establishments in Amsterdam, leaving open only a few dancings, and even then for the entertainment of their soldiers. Dykstra was very fond of dancing, and went to the dance hall with one of her friends 2 or 3 times a week. They would sit at a table, waiting for an invitation to dance. Each time Dijkstra went to a dance, the host would tell her the password for the evening. It was usually a simple phrase, but chosen so that it could not be accidentally uttered by an outsider. She never knew which of the many possible partners would turn out to be a member of the resistance movement until, in the whirlwind of the dance, he would utter the innocuous-sounding password, as if by accident. Then she would in turn relay the master's errand to her partner. Such a gentleman never repeated his invitation to dance, much less tried to make a date with her. It was their custom, as Dijkstra told me with a touch of superiority, not to be interested in other members of the organization. In this way, everyone appeared to have fewer secrets which, if they failed, might come to the attention of the enemy. For about a year and a half she performed her duties in relative safety. But gradually the Gestapo were closing the ring around her master and his assistants, who were in complete ignorance. One morning, when Dijkstra was about to go to work, there was a hurried knock at the door of her room. She opened it and saw the worried face of Anton. Under this nickname lurked the master's friend and one of the active members of their group. Anton told her that the owner and all the others had been arrested by the Gestapo, and that he had escaped arrest only because he had not slept at home that night. Now there was a danger that sooner or later one of the arrested would crack, and then they would be in trouble, and therefore it was necessary to escape, and immediately. There was no time for packing and tender farewells. Anton had long been in touch with the organizer of the escape and knew where to turn for help. Dijkstra grabbed her purse and ran out of the house with Anton, leaving to the mercy of fate dear to her heart apartment and all her possessions. They went to an address that led them to a dilapidated warehouse. There Anton introduced Dijkstra to a man named Billy. As it turned out, Billy worked for a group closely related to the group run by Dijkstra's former boss. Billy was now also under threat of arrest and was about to flee Holland. Billy had no objection to Anton and Dijkstra joining him. The more fugitives there were, the better the chances of a successful escape. At night, continued Dijkstra, they began their journey. They were passed from one guide to another. By a roundabout way through Brussels, they reached Paris. From Paris, they travelled by train to Lyon, where they stopped for a few days. Then they travelled south again by buses and finally on foot to the Pyrenees. There they contacted a smuggler from the Basque country who knew all the trails and mountain crossings. With his help, suffering from extreme cold, the passes in early spring were still covered with snow. They made their way through the mountain range. Finally, the moment came when they crossed the border and found themselves in Spain. So far, Dijkstra's story seemed quite plausible. I already knew from other sources that the cell, which was run by Dijkstra's master in Amsterdam, had been uncovered by the Gestapo. It was even known that Anton and Billy had gotten out of Holland by one of the escape routes. We knew all about their progress up to Lyon. Then the trail was lost. None of our agents mentioned that Anton and Billy were accompanied by a girl, but that could not be a basis for accusing Dijkstra of lying. Hastily coded and minute radiograms rarely contained all the details, and the name of Dijkstra, a less prominent member of the group of 3 fugitives, might well have been omitted. I began to question her in more detail about the route and the guides who had accompanied the group. Dijkstra answered promptly and confidently, but as the picture of the flight came out in all its details, some strange feeling took possession of me. Each of the routes and liaison agents mentioned had recently been uncovered by the Germans, the failure of the Lyon group having occurred a day or two after Dijkstra and her comrades had travelled along its route. All this could, of course, have been a series of unfortunate coincidences, but it could not be ruled out that Dijkstra did not follow this route at all. The Gestapo headquarters could have instructed her thoroughly, after the necessary information had been squeezed out of the unfortunate prisoners who had tried to escape by that route. My next question was interrupted by a knock on the door. Gawkins poked his head in, muttered an apology, and asked if I could come out into the corridor to see him for a moment. I had to restrain myself from answering him sharply. How the devil can one conduct a serious interrogation while being limited in time and constantly interrupted? Gawkins was so frightened and agitated that he was afraid of his own shadow, and yet I would have preferred it if he had not been stepping on my heels all the time. When I left the office, Gawkins was thrashing about the corridor in a state of great anxiety. He begged me to hurry up and finish my conversation with Dijkstra. The Duke had another fit of rage, and this time he telephoned the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. He seemed to know by name all the big bosses and vowed to call all his acquaintances and complain about the extremely insulting reception that was given to him and his companion. "In the name of all that is dear to you," said Gawkins, pleadingly, "get this matter over with. If we don't get them out of here in a few minutes, you and I may be court-martialed. For you, military service is a temporary matter, but for me it's a career. I have a wife and 2 children."
"Look," I said, "I'm sorry you're in this mess, but there's nothing left for you to do but lead this old cat around for a while longer. I need to finish my interrogation, and that doesn't mean asking a few trivial questions. Besides, I can't interrupt a case I've already started."
"How long do you think this can go on?" Gawkins said pleadingly. I shrugged. "It's hard to say. The longest interrogation I know of lasted 3.5 weeks. "Oh, God!" Gawkins couldn't say any more. He leaned against the wall of the corridor and wiped his face with his handkerchief. "What shall I tell the Duke?" he asked pitifully, heading for the officer's room. I could not help smiling at him. Apologizing to Dijkstra, I asked her to continue the story from the moment when she and her companions reached the territory of Spain. There was not much further to tell. After crossing the border, the group had travelled southwest on foot toward Portugal. Spain was considered neutral, but they nevertheless had to be on their guard. Therefore, they generally lay in ambush during the day and travelled at night, all on foot, except for a short stretch when they managed to steal 2 bicycles. The members of the group took turns riding them for about 30 or 40 kilometres before both machines broke down. "What happened to your companions?" I asked. "Are Anton and Billy still in Lisbon?" "No," she replied. "They are unfortunate. They never managed to get there." "How so?" "I couldn't stand it. We had a tremendous stroke of luck. 2 or 3 days more, and we would have been safe on the other side of the Portuguese border. As I told you, we were travelling at night, and one day we lost our way. Of course, we should have waited until dawn, but apparently, having travelled a long way without difficulty, we underestimated the danger we were in." "What do you mean by that?" "After we lost our way, Anton decided to knock on a house and make inquiries. Billy objected at first, but Anton convinced him that there was no risk at all. They left me on the road behind the wattle. It turned out that Anton and Billy had chosen a house that was occupied by the local police squad. Anton's question about the road to Portugal aroused the suspicion of the gendarme who opened the door. Both my companions were immediately arrested. I heard the shouts and the noise, but I could do nothing. If I had tried to help them, I would not be standing before you now. For about an hour I hid behind the fence, and then I decided to move on. Poor things. They were captured on the last stretch of the path. I still berate myself for not stopping them. There were tears in Dijkstra's eyes. I pondered. Tired people sometimes do irrational things, and the knowledge that the goal has actually been reached can give an overconfidence. But at the same time, it seemed strange to me that 2 experienced resistance fighters, who had travelled over 1,000 kilometres, would lose their way at the end of a journey and risk knocking on an unfamiliar door. "When did this happen?" I asked. "I beg your pardon," replied Dijkstra, "but so many things have happened in this short time that I have lost count of the days. Let me count. Today is the 14th, isn't it? Then it was 10 days ago. The 4th. When did you arrive in Lisbon?" 3 days after that. Just a week ago."
"And where did all this come from?" I pointed to her fine suit and her fancy hat. "Did you bring it with you?"
"Of course not," Dijkstra said, smiling embarrassedly. "When I reached Lisbon, all my clothes were rags. The next day I happened to meet the Duke, an old friend of my family. He took pity on me and generously bought me new clothes."
"That's really generous," I muttered. "But where did you meet him?"
"In the lobby of the Hotel Aviz. He had a room there and was just leaving the hotel when he saw me. I knew that the Hotel Aviz was probably the most luxurious hotel in Lisbon and the most suitable place for people like the Duke. but hardly any refugees came here. Even bombings couldn't make the Claridges, and the Ritz open its doors wide to random people. The war had passed Lisbon by, and social standards had to be enforced there as strictly as in pre-war London. I doubted that a lonely girl in rags could have entered a hotel like the Aviz past the watchful eye of the doorman. Besides, what was a penniless refugee to do in a fashionable hotel? I was about to ask Dijkstra about all this when there was another knock at the door. This time Gawkins had sent a messenger to summon me. But this was bordering on the ridiculous. How could I concentrate on an interrogation that required great mental exertion when I was so often distracted? The angry utterances I had prepared for Gawkins, as I left the office, disappeared at the mere sight of his dejected face. He looked utterly distraught and told me that the Duke was furious, calling Whitehall again and complaining that he was being kept waiting. The Duke bellowed into the telephone receiver with such vigour that Gawkins, who was in the next room, could hear him talking about God-imagining bureaucrats and bloodthirsty slobbering bureaucrats who think they have the right to detain a person on a responsible errand. "I must tell you, Pinter," said Gawkins, "I can wait no longer. You have been interrogating this girl for half an hour. Surely you can tell whether she is all right or not. Among other things, if she were a spy, the Duke would never have contacted her. Why don't we just let them both go? After all, if we don't let them go in a few minutes, both you and I can tender our resignations before they're demanded from above." "I am very sorry," I replied calmly, "but the matter must be brought to a conclusion. There is something false in that girl's story." "Can you prove it now?" "Not yet." "Then I beg you, hurry up. What brings you here today?" "May I remind you that it was you who asked for my help?" The tone of my voice was quite harsh. Besides, the longer we stand there and continue this childish argument, the more impatient the Duke will be. Before Gawkins could reply anything, a shout from the officer's room at the end of the corridor was heard from the Duke's room. A growl that sounded like the moaning of a hungry lion, which apparently meant that his lordship was preparing for another outburst of rage. Gawkins, like a frightened hare, darted away. I turned, hit the fire bucket next to me with the toe of my boot, jumped up in pain, and cursed. But then a new thought struck me. When I entered the office and sat down, I stared at Dijkstra for a few minutes without saying a word. Then I said, "Now, let's get this straight. You crossed the Spanish border about 2 months ago." "Yes." "And arrived in Lisbon 6 weeks later." "Yes." "That means you travelled about 1,000 kilometres in 6 weeks, about 150 kilometres a week." "Yes, but as I told you once before, we stole bicycles and rode them until they broke down." "That's good." "But still, you walked most of the way?" Yeah. Yeah. All right." "Laughs, take your shoes off," I commanded. Dijkstra was so surprised that she obeyed. With a quick, "Excuse me," I bent down and felt the foot of her right leg through the thin silk stocking. She looked at me with surprised eyes and obviously thought I was going crazy. "Miss Dijkstra," I said sharply, "these are not the feet of a man who has just walked about 1,000 kilometres in 6 weeks and has worn out the soles of his shoes to the point where they are no thicker than a sheet of paper. In a foot soldier, the skin hardens around the heels and on the foot. Your feet are as soft as a child's. You arrived in Lisbon on the padded seat of a German staff car, not on these small, pampered feet." Dijkstra realised she had lost. She tried to make a joke, but I, without answering, continued to stare mockingly at her feet. Finally she gave in and confessed everything. It turns out that she fell in love with a lieutenant of German intelligence and under his influence agreed to work for the Nazis. Hitler's intelligence reached the rumour that the Duke of Monmouth will fly to Lisbon on behalf of the International Red Cross. Intelligence and previously knew about his weakness for pretty girls, and that before the war he had several prominent friends in Holland. The Abwehr's plan was as follows. Dijkstra was to make the Duke's acquaintance by introducing herself to him as a distant relative of one of his friends. Anton and Billy had indeed been captured shortly before near Lyon. If Dijkstra had told the Duke that she had only accompanied Anton and Billy during their escape from Holland, and had kept silent about the French part of the route, she would not only have won the Duke's sympathy, but would have had a ready and solid legend by the time of interrogation on arrival in England. The Abwehr believed that in the case of the Duke's sponsorship of her questioning by counterintelligence will be superficial. I called the Duke and the head of the airbase. The first stormed in an angry state, but before he had time to express the feelings boiling in him, I managed to say, "Your companion, an old family friend, has just confessed to being a German agent. We will detain her here until her confession is written and certified, and then she will be sent to London. You may be charged with aiding and abetting her criminal schemes, but I have no intention of arresting you. I suggest that you go home and consider yourself under house arrest until this case is concluded. You may have to surrender your passport, and I ask you not to leave London without further notice." There was the silence that usually comes before a bomb goes off. But this time it was limited to a soft clap as His Lordship the Duke of Monmouth obediently left the room. That's the end of the story. As far as I know, Dykstra was not put on trial. The charge against her contained few facts, and the higher authorities may have thought it unwise in time of war to bring a head of a noble family to trial as an accessory to a case on a charge of espionage. Dykstra was interned until the end of the war and then transported to Holland. There she was to stand trial in a Dutch court for crimes against her people. The Duke, of course, was not guilty of trying to help the spy. Like many men, he believed the pretty face and the innocent-sounding story. But I believe he learned his lesson. The last word in this story belongs to a sigh of relief from Gawkins, who, as he saw me and Albert off, said, "So I now know what the letters VOC mean. It is, rather, a very reckless man. As soon as the enemy has revealed a method of intelligence, it should be abandoned immediately. This is one of the first postulates to be internalized. No matter how cunning the scheme, and no matter how reliable it may have seemed before, it must be discarded the second the secret ceases to be a secret. Training an agent requires many months and even years. To expose a brave and intelligent man to unnecessary risk amounts to a needless waste of precious time and effort, not to mention a senseless sacrifice. During the 2 world wars, German intelligence was famous for the thoroughness of the development of its operations. It often went to endless lengths to prepare the agent and his documentation in accordance with the chosen legend and the assigned task. An example is the famous Van der Kieboom case. The Abwehr provided him with a suit of English fabric, and even English tailoring his identity card matched the original exactly in colour and had the necessary marks. If our counterintelligence had not received prior knowledge of his impending arrival, he could easily have blended in with the motley population of wartime England. If German intelligence had a flaw, it was primarily a commitment to mass production agents knew their tasks by heart, but not enough attention was paid to the development of initiative or quick reaction to an unexpected situation. In addition, the Abwehr stubbornly too often used methods that had long been exposed by our counterintelligence. These remarks serve as a preface to one of the most difficult cases I have had to deal with. The events described below relate to the story of Cornelis Verloop. At the end of October 1944, I was head of the Dutch counterintelligence mission to the headquarters of the Supreme Allied Commander and was in Eindhoven. Strange things were happening in a country that had been under occupation for 4 years and was suddenly liberated. Cases of collaboration with the enemy are streaming in, ranging from the most open and frank to the wildly fantastic, usually generated by a desire to pay for old grievances. Members of the public face one of the most difficult challenges when they witness an enemy occupation of their town or neighbourhood. Take, for example, the local doctor. Is it his duty to remain at his post and help the sick, even though it means he has to follow the instructions and orders of the military commandant? Or should he go into hiding and leave the sick to fend for themselves? What should the priest or the burgomaster do then? Should they remain in their posts at the risk of being later accused of collaborating with the enemy? Or, on the contrary, being patriots, should they abandon the people to their fate? There can be no ready answer to all these questions. Every citizen, faced with the cruel reality of the enemy occupation of his homeland, must find the answer to such questions for himself. It is difficult for those who choose a path condemned by society.
While in Eindhoven, I was searching for the right path in the labyrinth of accusations and counter-accusations, trying to discover who is a traitor and who is a patriot. I had to sift and check the facts in favor of accusations and justifications to identify the motives that guided the actions of the accusers and the accused. It was exhausting work.
One day I had to meet a man named Hendrik. He had been leading a group of the resistance movement for about 3 years and had proved himself to be an active fighter and an ardent opponent of the Nazis. He was a man of average height with incredibly broad shoulders and huge arms. I had long since left the lightweight category, but I felt that in a fight he could lift me up and break my back as easily as a peasant turns the head off a chicken. One day, together with other members of the resistance movement group, Hendrik was ambushed by the Gestapo and arrested. 2 days later, Hendrik escaped, but the Gestapo managed to permanently disfigure him by crushing his kneecap with blows from a rubber truncheon. Their efforts to get him to talk were unsuccessful. I met Hendrik shortly after arriving in Eindhoven. This patriot was worthy of reward for his heroic deeds. The group led by Hendrik was a constant source of anxiety to the Germans and had confined an entire German brigade to its area of operations. This contributed greatly to the success of the Allied offensive. Hendrik could be relied upon in times of need, his judgment could be trusted. And there he was, sitting in front of me, exposing a member of his group. Hendrik was clearly not pleased with the step he had taken. In his huge hand he held a short, knotted pipe, and as he spoke he twirled it so that it looked as if it were about to crack. He had already given me the name of the man whom he considered a traitor, Cornelis Verloop. He had also given me the facts that had aroused his suspicions. I had to verify the validity of his accusations. "How long had you known this Verloop?" I asked. "Practically all my life," Hendrik grumbled. "My father was a close friend of his father's. I'm a good 10 or 12 years older than Cornelis, and I've known him since he was under the table." "So he's about 25 now?" "A little more than that. I'm almost 40. When did he join your group?" 2 or 3 years ago. Mid-1942. "And at that time you had no reason to suspect him of anything?" "I'm sorry, Colonel," he smiled for the first time since our conversation began, "but we would hardly have accepted him if we had suspicions." "Not necessarily," I remarked. "There is a saying in England that a criminal may be let off with a length of rope long enough to hang himself. I have known of cases in which persons who were suspected were given serious assignments, but were carefully watched." "But not in our group," Hendrik replied sharply. "We took great care in vetting newcomers before we put them in the group." "Well, what were Verloop's duties?" "His normal daily duties or his tasks in the resistance movement?" "No, his daily work." "After high school, Cornelis worked in our town in a large radio factory. A skilled craftsman, he must have performed well at work, because at the beginning of the war he was promoted to foreman. After the Nazis entered the city, the first thing they did was to take over the factory." "Yes, that's right. They converted the factory to tank and airplane parts." "So Verloop worked for the Nazis and under their supervision for over 4 years?" "Yes, but in the interest of fairness, half of the city's working population worked in that radio factory. Not going to work in the factory meant starving to death. I wouldn't blame him for that." "In any case, as you just said, Verloop's behaviour up to the moment he joined your group was impeccable. What, then, made you suspect him of treachery?" Hendrik shrugged his shoulders.
"I can't tell you about a single incident, but a lot of small facts put together seem to me a solid basis."
"Tell me at least some of those facts." "First of all, it should be said that the security service of the Nazis was always on the alert. At night they had posts in all the most important points on bridges, at the gates of the radio factory, in the railroad depot. Besides, at night one could not walk even 10 meters without running into a German patrol." "So what?" "So whenever Verloop went out on a mission, strange as it may seem, but somehow mysteriously the Germans disappeared. We already knew that if Verloop took part in an operation, it was like a Sunday stroll." "There are more fortunate and less fortunate people," I remarked. "I've seen it before." Hendrik nodded grimly. "Yes, that's what we thought. If it was known that Verloop was going on a mission, all the members of the group would volunteer to go with him. The boys looked upon him as a lucky charm. Do you think that he informed the Nazis in advance about the upcoming operation, and they left the group he was part of alone? Yes, that's exactly right. But you don't have any proof, I said. It could have been a coincidence. Maybe. But the opposite is also true. Verloop had never been involved in an unsuccessful raid. Why wouldn't he? He always had some excuse, a bad cough, a cold or something like that. Cornelis is obsessed with his health. Constantly pills, ointments and iodine for every scratch, and if his stomach hurts, he can't do without a doctor. Hendrik's voice was full of the contempt that a brave man might feel for a sissy and a slob. But a cough alone could not be a reason for Cornelis' refusal to participate in a particular operation, could it? He could be much sicker than that. And generally speaking, you can't declare a man an enemy agent just because he takes care of his health. But don't you find it surprising that the operations in which he was involved ended successfully, while the groups that went on a mission without him were ambushed? Every time. Isn't that suspicious? Suspicious. I agree with you on that, but it doesn't prove his guilt.
All right. What about the bridge story?
What bridge? Didn't I tell you about it? 5 kilometers east of town, the railroad enters a long gully and the highway crosses it on a large stone bridge. We received orders to blow up the bridge. The idea was that the collapsed bridge would block the railroad for a long period of time. The Allies hoped thus to prevent the transfer of German reinforcements in Holland and Belgium. British aircraft made several attempts to bombard the bridge, but they ended in failure. The area was literally dotted with anti-aircraft guns, and their fire was too intense for the British planes to get through to the object. That's when we got the assignment to try to blow up the bridge. We usually took it in turns to do the difficult jobs, and it happened that this time it was Cornelis' turn. He led the boys that night, and they blew the damn bridge. And after all that, you suspect him of being a traitor? I asked with undisguised disbelief. It wasn't that bridge. A small footbridge not far from the main bridge. The Nazis cleared the rubble by the middle of the next day. Naturally, after that they doubled, and even tripled the posts on the main bridge, and we had no chance to launch a surprise attack on it. What did Verloop say about it? You probably questioned him. Of course I did. The night was dark, the distance had been miscalculated. There was no time to be sure of the exact position on either side of the bridge, and in the dark it looked like a main bridge. Could it have been a natural mistake? I asked. I should like to be fair, he muttered. Believe me, I hate to blame one of my guys. Especially a guy I've known since he was a boy. Such a mistake is possible. I suppose Verloop was worried or lost his way in the dark and mistook one bridge for another. In isolation, I might regard this fact as a mistake, but if other strange events are in view, the culprit can only be called a traitor. I think it would be wise for me to see this Verloop and have a talk with him. You would oblige me very much, Colonel, said Hendrik. If you think him innocent, I will be the first to shake hands with him. In my heart, I even hope he is not guilty. It is not good to suspect one of your own, but if you prove him guilty, everyone must know it. Don't worry about the trial. We'll settle this quietly. With an involuntary movement, Hendrik stretched his strong arms over the table. I shuddered inwardly. A man like him would not spare a traitor. If Verloop is guilty, he will stand trial. My voice was harsh. I cannot allow vigilantism. Hendrik smiled embarrassedly. I beg your pardon, Colonel, he muttered. I forgot that the law has again triumphed in our land. May I tell Verloop that you wish to see him? No, perhaps not. If he knows of your suspicions, it will only alarm him. Tell me, is he and the others aware of the real objectives of my work? I don't think many people know. Then let it be announced that I am writing a report for the Allied High Command in Europe on the activities of the Dutch resistance movement. Well, that's not so far from the truth. I will naturally have to meet all those who took an active part in the resistance movement in the Eindhoven area. If I invite Verloop, let's hope he'll regard it as a routine survey. Hendrik agreed. It should work. So I'll announce it, if you don't mind. Hendrik said to me. Yes, of course. Hendrik rose, almost crushed my hand in a farewell shake, and limped toward the door. In order to disguise the plan, I had several conversations with members of the local resistance movement. Finally, after about a week, it was Cornelis Verloop's turn to present the information for my report to the Allied High Command in Europe. However, the plan we had devised with Hendrik, which was intended to put Verloop's vigilance to rest, could not be carried out as we wished. On the eve of the day on which Verloop was to appear before me, I received a top-secret message from a colleague of mine who worked as a liaison officer at High Command headquarters. The message read as follows: a senior German counterintelligence officer who had recently been captured stated that he had been associated with one Cornelis Verloop in the Eindhoven area. The message also contained instructions to interrogate Verloop and to keep him under strict arrest until the circumstances of the case were fully clarified. The next day, Verloop was arrested and taken to my temporary office. The message from headquarters confirmed Hendrik's worst suspicions, and yet I still wished to treat the case without prejudice. The war was not yet over, and the Germans might hope to retake Eindhoven someday. It would be foolish to expect a German counterintelligence officer to give away his actual contacts in the area. He might have learned Verloop's name by chance from the lists of workers at the radio factory, where Verloop played a far from insignificant role. The officer's actions could have been part of a plan to conceal the real facts and to try to misdirect our counterintelligence efforts by raising suspicion against an innocent man. The case was conducted in accordance with normal practice. Verloop was thoroughly searched. The things seized from him now lay before me, and he himself awaited interrogation in custody in an adjoining room. I had long ago learned the rule that before interrogation a suspect's belongings should be examined with the greatest care. The contents of his pockets may give an idea of his character, habits and mode of life. If, for example, he carries a comb, a pair of pocket scissors, and a saw, it is easy to guess that he cares about his appearance and may even be vain. Having pornographic postcards in his wallet obviously indicates dissatisfaction with family life, and the person conducting the interrogation should keep this in mind when determining the direction of the interrogation. But it is even more important to find clues to the method of communication with the enemy. Espionage loses all meaning if the spy is deprived of the ability to communicate the information he or she has obtained. And here I have Verloop's personal effects. These are the most common personal items. I disassembled a cheap fountain pen, just in case, looked into the cap and the inside of the case, but they contained nothing suspicious. A rather dirty handkerchief did not look like a disguised geographical map, and small bills of money, amounting to a rather modest sum, even when examined under a strong light, revealed no secret marks. In Verloop's hand watch of the common Dutch model, after I had pierced the strap with a pin, removed the glass, and taken out the movement in search of secrets and conventions, nothing could be found to confirm the suspicions. The tattered leather wallet contained, in addition to money, an identity card, a photograph of a smiling woman with a child, a couple of postage stamps, and a notebook with a calendar. The notebook interested me. On every page of the notebook, up to the week we had experienced, there were notes that looked like a kind of code. During the interrogation, I decided to concentrate on this book, but later it turned out to be a tactical mistake. In addition to the items listed above, Verloop also had a box of matches. Much of the morning was spent examining these modest possessions of Verloop. I arranged for him to be given an early lunch, fortified myself, and set the interrogation to begin at 1:00 in the afternoon. Verloop entered the room, while the guards remained in the corridor. I pointed Verloop to a chair on the other side of the table and scrutinized him for a few moments.
He was a guy in his 30s with a pleasant face and a straight face. He had good poise and looked like a physically trained man. I already knew from Hendrik that Verloop took care of his health, and from the few movements he had made in my room it was not difficult to recognize him as an athlete. I held out a pack of cigarettes across the table, but he refused. As I lit one, Verloop gave a passionate speech. He was outraged that he had been arrested by his own, as he put it, in broad daylight, in his own house, in front of his astonished neighbours.
"You know dirt sticks," Verloop said. "I am sure of my innocence, and you will soon realise it too. But what will the comrades think? They will now point their fingers at me and murmur behind my back. They are not real comrades if they are ready to believe the worst I remarked. Don't worry, Verloop, if you are innocent as you claim, we'll see to it that it is known widely enough." "What am I accused of?" he asked. "It is I and no one else. If I had been hanging around doing nothing, that would be understandable. But I took part in the resistance movement, risked my life many times, and this is the thanks I get. Why don't you go to our leader, Hendrik himself? He's a good guy. He'll probably confirm that I did my duty honourably." I suppressed an involuntary chuckle and remained silent, giving Verloop a chance to speak. When he began to repeat himself, I interrupted him. "Look here, Verloop, the sooner we start talking about the case, the sooner you can prove your innocence. So why don't you tell us about yourself, your work, how you joined the resistance movement, and any other things or events you think are relevant? There is no hurry, but there is no time to waste." Verloop began to speak again, and the words flowed uncontrollably. Verloop told me that in school he had taken a lot of athletics, won several medals in middle distance running, was a good swimmer, and in this sport he had defended the honour of his district in competitions. Verloop said with a chuckle that he never excelled in mental work, but he was skillful and interested in the laws of electricity as a boy. For this reason, after graduating from high school in 1932, he directed his footsteps to a radio factory. He worked diligently. Soon he was noticed by the administration and promoted. By the time of his marriage, just before the outbreak of war, having barely reached the age of 24, he was appointed shop steward. In the 40th year, a daughter was born to him. He continued to work at the factory even after the German occupation of Holland. "Why didn't you join the army in the 39th year, being a physically strong guy?" I interrupted Verloop. It is known that Holland did not enter the war at the beginning, but the army was getting stronger and needed volunteers. "It may not sound very patriotic," Verloop said with a chuckle, "but I thought the war wouldn't touch us. Besides, it's only been about 2 months since I got married and got a good job." It was a frank answer. At the beginning of the war, you'd often hear business people realised too late what the war had brought, often after they had begun to feel the bitterness of defeat as a result of the German blitzkrieg. You have just said that you joined the resistance movement in 42nd year, 2 years after the Nazi occupation of the country. Why so late? Verloop shrugged. "Put yourself in my shoes," he said. "I didn't want any complications. I had my wife and little daughter in my arms. I knew that the Germans had treated many people badly, but life is life. As for me, the Nazi owners of the factory behaved correctly. Among other things, I did not feel that I had shown myself less patriotic than others. Not me, so another would have been in my place at the factory. If we did a good job, the owners sometimes gave us a bonus. We received a coupon for butter or sugar. You have to think about such things when you have a wife and child." Verloop evidently noticed the expression on my face, for he immediately added, "Don't misunderstand me. I never took the path of helping the Germans. I did my job, that's all. Apparently I was not born a hero. My principle has always been to live and let others live." I only nodded my head, saying nothing in reply, but in my heart I did not blame Verloop. It is easy for a man who has not experienced the horrors of the occupation to conclude that every citizen has a duty to take up arms in defence of the fatherland. But one often forgets the probable fate of his family. After hesitating for a moment, I asked,
"By what rite of passage did you join the resistance movement?"
Strangely enough, it was my wife who convinced me to do so. The leader of the group I eventually joined had already asked me several times to join them. He knew that the nature of my work allowed me to move freely around the factory, and he expected me to help the group organise sabotage or gather information. I said at once that sabotage was ruled out. The Germans had a well-developed control system, and it would not take them long to determine which shop in the plant was responsible for a defect in lamps or switches. I told Hendrik bluntly that if I tried to do something like that, the Germans would catch me in a couple of days. But I agreed to let him know when any special shipment of equipment was about to leave the factory. If he and his boys blew up that equipment when it was already waiting to be shipped and was in the freight cars, it wouldn't concern me. So you started passing information to the resistance movement? Yes, it went on for months. One thing led to another. One night they decided to blow up one of the labs where top-secret equipment was being tested. I knew the factory better than most, as well as the routes of the German patrols. That's why they chose me as a guide. Never in my life had I felt such fear as I did that time. I began gradually to sympathize with Verloop. His childish grin was infectious, and if earlier I had seen vanity in his attitude to physical fitness, now his admission that he was not a born daredevil won me over. So by the end of the 42nd year, you had become a full-fledged member of the resistance group. According to the information I have, you were lucky. Every time you went on a mission, the German patrols that swarmed the area did not disturb the group. On the same occasions when you missed an operation, the group sent to carry it out was ambushed. How do you explain that? Verloop spread his hands. How can I explain it? It's one of those phenomena that defies explanation. Why do some people win at cards and others always lose? It's a matter of luck. I know it creates all kinds of rumours. What about the surgeries you've missed? I was told that a trifling cough or a slight cold has sometimes served as a reason for you to refuse to participate in this or that operation. That's also true. Look, Colonel, I don't know if you've ever been on a night out. Well, here's the thing. Suppose you're standing in the dark, holding your breath. You hear the slightest rustle, like the squeak of a soldier's boot, or the rustle of a rifle strap. And you stand there like a statue, praying to God that nothing betrays your presence, and if some idiot starts sneezing or coughing at the most crucial moment, it's all gone. One cough can give away 10 people, believe me. I would never take someone with a cough. Do you agree with me? That's reasonable, I said, catching myself in the thought that I agreed with Verloop. But I have heard other things. About the explosion of a bridge, but not the one that was to be destroyed. Verloop blushed. I don't know who told you about it, he said heartily, but at any rate, that man cannot be my friend. It is true that I blew up the wrong bridge, but that gives no reason to suspect me of being a German agent. And yet I blew up the bridge. Sometimes airplanes throw bombs past their target. Can the crew members of such an airplane be called spies? I could not answer this question. Besides, Verloop impressed me with his directness and convincing answers. He admitted that he was far from being a hero, and yet he performed his missions honestly. Could Hendrik have been wrong in his suspicions? Hendrik was a different sort of man, and maybe the fact that Verloop did not seem brave enough to him had led Hendrik too far in his estimation. As I pondered this, I took another cigarette and held it out to Verloop. He smiled and gestured with his hand to decline thank you. I don't smoke. Sorry, I keep forgetting. You probably think smoking is bad for you, don't you? A pack of cigarettes was lying on top of his wallet. I took the wallet and took out a photograph. Your wife and daughter. Yes, he answered proudly. A close-knit family. And what's this? I pointed to a rectangular white card with printed characters on one side. In the corner was Verloop's photograph with his signature. This is my factory pass. Most workers have green passes to enter through the main gate, but I had a special one, a white one that gave me the right to go into most of the factory's shops. Right. Now I decided to use my main trump card. Taking a pocket calendar book in my hand, I began to turn the pages, watching the expression on Verloop's face, which remained indifferent. There are groups of numbers on each page, I remarked. Look, there are 66 and 5/10, then 62 and 16. On the next page, 66 and 4/10, 64 and again 16, and so on. Can you explain the meaning of these figures? Verloop took the calendar from my hands and began to look through it. After a few minutes, to my surprise, he laughed. I beg your pardon, he said. Seeing my surprise, I shouldn't have laughed like that. I understand what you are suggesting, but it is not that, I assure you. It's not a cipher for communicating with the Germans. It's much simpler than that. Every day after gymnastics or swimming, I checked my weight, pulse, and respiratory rate. 66 5/10 means 66.5 kilograms, 62 is the pulse rate that day, and 16 is the number of breaths per minute. That was it. Mehr. I had no choice but to laugh along with him. Reviewing the notebook, I put the cigarette in the tin can that served as an ashtray. Taking the cigarette again, I was disappointed to find that it had gone out. Without thinking, I reached for the box of matches that lay among Verloop's things, and I happened to notice a look of excitement on Verloop's face. I weighed the box on my hand and shook it so that the contents rattled like a rattle. Then I opened the box and spread the matches on the table. Verloop seemed to stop breathing. I put the matches in a row. There were about a dozen of them. At first sight they all looked alike, but on closer inspection I saw that the heads of 4 of them were of a paler colour than the others. I looked Verloop in the eye and said, "I will tell you a little story. About 2 years ago, 2 brothers, Dutchmen, docked a boat on the coast of England. In Holland, they deliberately created a reputation for themselves as persons sympathetic to Germany, and after appropriate training were sent by the Gestapo to England with a spy mission. They were ordered to pass themselves off as refugees, and after receiving permission from the English authorities to reside in England, to send the German intelligence required information. Unfortunately for the enemy, the 2 Dutchmen turned out to be true patriots. They deceived the Germans. As proof of their sincerity, they showed us a clever method of transmitting information which they had been taught. Do I need to tell you about this method?" "As you wish." Verloop shrugged his shoulders. "Though I don't see what it has to do with me." "A little patience. The point is that the brothers had several boxes of matches. Some matches were real, others were fake. The heads of the latter were made of a special chemical composition, which after wetting allowed to apply secret writing. Such matches looked like real matches, except that their heads were a little paler in colour, like these 4. Let's try this match. Strange it won't light. Or maybe it served its purpose. You could use the pass that the Germans gave you and write on the blank side of it details of the resistance group's activities with one of these special matches. All you had to do was hand the pass to the guard as you entered a classified workshop in the factory. When you left the shop, he would return it to you. Isn't that the way it was, Verloop?" I leaned back in my chair and watched Verloop. He blinked incessantly and made strange swallowing motions. I kept looking at him, fiddling with the matches. He stared at my hand as if hypnotized, and after 2 or 3 minutes he, as they say, cracked up. Verloop told all. He had indeed joined the resistance movement, and mostly because his wife was incessantly sarcastic toward him. Eventually Verloop joined the group, but his heart was not in this kind of work, and he soon lost heart. He told the Nazis everything, bidding for his life in exchange for information about the activities of the resistance movement group. The Germans offered him to stay in Hendrik's group, but arranged so that during operations with his participation ambushes were not organized. They even allowed Verloop to blow up a small bridge so that he could prove to his fellow resistance group members that he had done his duty to the end. When a person splits for real, they tend to tell considerably more than what one expects to hear. In an effort to demonstrate his sincerity and ease the weight of guilt, Verloop gave away information that was the key to uncovering another traitor. But that is another story. Verloop himself was tried in Holland as a traitor and spy. By some miracle he escaped the death penalty and was sentenced to life imprisonment. Verloop was exposed for 2 reasons. First, he was carrying matches. Though he did not smoke. Second, Verloop's masters were careless in continuing to use a method of communication which we had long ago discovered.